Welcome back, everyone. Here we are in the course on bioethics in the Master of Molecular and Cell Biology at St. Thomas University. And this is lecture number 15 out of 17. So we have 2 more to go. Okay. All right, beginning always with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Any questions or comments from previous stuff? No? So I've been sending your corrected summaries by mail, by regular mail. Have you been getting them? Regular mail?
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nomi. All right, good. Yeah, I need to send some more, accumulate them when I have 2, 3, more or less, or 4. So I'll send out some more today. In the meantime, you notice that I do post the grade there on the on Canvas, so you can always see your current grade on Canvas. All right, so today we're going to be looking at transgenderism, again, within the context of healthcare bioethics. And because it can be done, right? Some people are opting for this. And then what we have left next week, we're going to look at transplantation, organ transplantation. And then the last lecture is going to be on the coronavirus 19 and COVID, because again, looking at some of the controversial issues in bioethics today in healthcare. So I'm dividing today's lecture into 2 parts. First, just a review of human sexual development, psychosexual development, because it's not only physical, it's also psychological, right? What we call the sexual identity or sexual orientation. And then we'll do the bioethical analysis of transgender, or those people who feel that they are in the wrong body, essentially, as they say in their own words, they're in the wrong body, okay? So kind of 2 parts. First thing I want to say about human psychosexual development is that it's pretty complex and not as straightforward as may seem, because we have several layers. I'm calling them layers. And these layers need to integrate harmoniously in order for us to have what is known as a normal sexual orientation. Normal, I'm using the word normal in a statistical sense, meaning what is the norm, in other words, what is the vast majority of the population to this day, all right? And the vast majority of the population to this day is what we call heterosexual. Heterosexual meaning that there's a natural attraction between men and women. It's a natural attraction. And so that's the norm. And it's cross-cultural and also transgeographic, if you will. We find that most men throughout the world, in whatever country they're living or continent, they feel attracted to women. And most women naturally feel attracted to men across the board, all right? So that's what establishes the norm. However, to come to that orientation as adults, several layers need to be integrated at the physical level, at the physiological level, and at the psychological level, all right? And one could even make the argument even at the spiritual level, which is the largest integration. There's even a biblical verse, if you will, that can be applied to this. I'll get to that in a little bit. Basically, the levels of orientation of levels of integration, all right, always begin at the genetic level, and then they evolve, or they expand rather, into the hormonal level, and then glandular level. And then once the baby is born, we go into the identity of self, which is also gradual. And the social identity, in other words, to realize that I am not other people, I am myself. That takes time. Eventually, we go through adolescence and physiological puberty, which psychologically can also consolidate our sexual orientation or not. Can get also disoriented during the teenage years. Finally, as adults, then we either have that normal orientation or we don't. Okay? So let me go through these layers a little more in detail, because as you can see, to get to the bottom line, as it were, literally to have the normal sexual orientation of feeling attracted to the opposite sex, all of these different layers have to integrate harmoniously over time. And it's actually years, in fact, decades for that to occur. So this is kind of a synopsis. This slide is a synopsis, and we'll review it again. Now I'm going to go a little bit in some of these categories, some more detailed than others. Starting with the first one here. Again, in summary fashion, because you're all scientists, you all know the basic biological background, that at the genetic and hormonal and glandular level, we basically share the same development as other mammals, which is that the sperm is the one that determines our sex, right? Because when you, so let's think of gametes for a moment. Gametes are haploid by definition, right? And so what is the sex composition of females? I'm talking about humans and mammals in general. Female mammals, the sex composition is XX, right? 2X chromosomes, the 23rd pair. And for males, it's XY. So it's interesting already to know that. It's interesting because you notice that we men have an X chromosome in us, which has the female sexual characteristics, the sexual genes. But there's also the one male chromosome, the Y chromosome, which has mostly the SRI gene, the SIR gene, which is the one that determines maleness, all right? Essentially producing the pathway of maleness. Females have XX, meaning that their sex chromosomes are all the female sex genes there. For the two types of characteristics, what do I mean by the two types of characteristics? You know, there are two types of sexual characteristics, what is known as primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics, right? All right, so primary sexual characteristics have to do with what? With the actual sexual organs, beginning with ovaries or testes, right? And then everything else about the reproductive organs in men and women. Those are the primary sexual characteristics. And they're called primary because they are involved in the progeny, in producing another progeny. Okay, they're primarily involved in producing progeny, in producing gametes, and then in the female hosting the gestating the embryo and so forth. Those are primary. Then there are secondary sexual characteristics that are also associated with the maleness or femaleness, but are not directly involved in the production of gametes or in the gestation of the embryo, the fetus. They're not involved directly, immediately in procreation, but they are peripheral. What are those secondary sexual characteristics? Right. So for example, we can look at hair, facial hair for men, the beard, the mustache, and so forth, even though some women have some. By the way, we have hair all over our bodies, okay, except the palms of our hands and the palms of our feet. What's that? The sole of the feet. The sole of the feet. Every other part of the skin, the integumentary system, has hair. Sometimes they're very tiny, we don't see them. Sometimes they're almost transparent, but we have hair all over except those parts of the skin. But it's more prominent in men, all right? And it is associated with a higher level of testosterone. Also, the change in voice in men as opposed to women and the vocal cords is something that happens there, that the voice becomes deeper in tone as opposed to women. Generally, women don't change their voice tone, right? In contrast, for women, the most prominent is the development of breast, even though we men also have breast and nipples, but they're non-functional, all right? Which is interesting because then that needs to, we need to see how those organs develop in the embryonic development before there is the full sexual differentiation between the male and the female embryos. But functional breast in women is a typical secondary sexual characteristic. There are other things that are also a little more internal. For example, the actual shape, the hip, the wider hip, and the wider hip has to do for women is because of the pelvic girdle. The pelvis is wider in women and more rounded so that the head of the fetus can go through. All right, so it's also a physiological thing. And you can see very graphically how natural selection would act on that, because a woman who would have a small pelvis before C-sections, all right, she would pretty much die from massive hemorrhage giving birth or attempting to give birth. We're going back in evolutionary time to primitive humans, all right? And so the smaller pelvis women were selected out early on in the evolution of humans. And that's why the vast majority of women today have the larger pelvis, because those are the women who survived, the ancestors who survived. All right, so those are some of the secondary sexual characteristics, but they are associated with the genes that are in the X and the Y chromosome. So when gametogenesis happens, oogenesis for women, the production of eggs, we know that those for one primary oocyte, which is diploid, primary oocyte, producing how many gametes? Each precursor cell, precursor sex cell, produces how many gametes? First of all, remember what is the process? Mitosis or meiosis? Give you a hint. It's meiosis, right? It's meiosis, which is kind of a double mitosis, at least as far as the number of cells. And so if it's a double mitosis, 2 + 2 is 4. So for each one primary gametocyte, there will be 4 gametes, 4 haploid gametes produced. The gametocytes could be either the oocyte or the spermatocyte, right? Depending if it's ova that are being produced or sperm. All right. So these haploid gametes then, for women, the eggs can only get X chromosome because it's only XX on the primary oocyte. So all 4 ova will have X and 1X. But for men, what happens? Because we get 1 chromosome from our mother, 1 sex chromosome from our mother, it can only be an X chromosome. And we get 1 chromosome from our father, which can either be an X or a Y chromosome. In other words, for sperm, when sperm are manufactured, right? because the primary spermatocyte of that sperm is XY. Every cell in a male's body is XY, correct? All right, so that's the primary spermatocyte. 4 gametes are produced, 4 sperm are produced. And of those 4, 2 of the 4 will have an X chromosome and 2 will have a Y chromosome. So it's a 50-50 distribution, 50%. Bump that number up to the full complement of sperm in an ejaculate, which I've mentioned is how much approximately for functionality, for a man to be considered competent or potent or capable of fertilizing. Normally it's between 100 and 150 million sperm, right, in one ejaculate. So let's go on the lower side of 100, just for the simple number, 100 million. That means that 50 million of those sperm are, as far as the sex chromosome is, 50 million of those sperm are X sperm, and the other 50 million are Y sperm. You follow? Just concentrating on the sex chromosomes. The other 22 autosomes are the same because they are pairs, right? Homologous pairs. All right. So you with me still? No problem? 50% on any average male ejaculate, 50% are X chromosome, X sperm, and the other 50% are Y sperm, just focusing on the sex chromosome. And that's why it all depends which sperm fertilizes. Obviously, if a Y sperm fertilizes the egg, what do we get? Y from the sperm, X from the ova, because the eggs can only have X, so we get an XY, which is a male. But if it is an X chromosome, X sperm that fertilizes, and we got X plus X, that's a girl. That will be a girl, all right? So that's how the sex is determined, boy, girl. It's on the sperm. And on average is 50-50 chance, statistically. All right. Now, just as an aside, for XY, which is male, if both chromosomes express, if the X chromosome expresses, then that is the SIR gene, and that will indicate maleness, right? But if the Y chromosome, but if the X chromosome expresses in the male, because we have one X chromosome, right, in each cell, in that zygote, the male zygote has an X chromosome. If that X chromosome expresses, what happens? That is, those are female genes, all right? So that would determine femaleness. And so going forward, beyond the morula, beyond the blastocyst, in gastrula, where we begin to have cellular differentiation, the 3 germ layers, and then further differentiation into organs and tissues, that little embryo is going to receive ambiguous signals. It's going to receive maleness and femaleness genes, all right, or proteins derived from the genes. And so it will be ambiguous. So you can see already at the genetic level, there can be some anomalies if the X chromosome expresses in male. So what happens is the X chromosome in males has to be shut down, has to be totally shut down very early on, so it doesn't express. Exactly. And so it's called silencing, all right? So the X chromosome in men have to be silenced. In other words, we men silenced, when we were zygotes, our zygote silenced our mother's X chromosome, okay? So it doesn't express for life, decades. And how does silencing, because it doesn't ditch out the chromosome, all right? It winds it up and winds it up and winds it up, super compact, super coiled, and pushes it up against the inner membrane of the nucleus, and then pray hard that it doesn't ever express. But it's there. It's kind of like a little polar body on the inside, equivalent. But basically, that's what happens. In fact, as Luis mentions, on the females, also, one of the 2 X chromosomes has to be silenced also. Has to be silenced. I confess my ignorance. I don't know if it's always the female, if it's always the mother's chromosome that's silenced, or if it's the father's X chromosome, right?
I think I
It's random. Yeah, I would think so because in my opinion, it's X for X. You know, they're homologous chromosomes. So in principle, they should look identical except for the fingerprinting of the father or the mother. So the X chromosome in the little girl comes from the father, right? One from the father, one from the mother. So I don't know at the biochemical level, but I would think that it's random as long as one of the two gets silenced. And that's very important because otherwise, why would we have? You can say, well, it's X for X chromosome. No, it can express it's only X genes anyway, it's female genes. Yeah, but it's a double quantity. It's a double quantity of expression, all right? So it's an overexpression. So basically, it would make like a super female, too much femaleness, all right? Double the load, the chromosome load, which is a no-no. And therefore, one of those two X chromosomes in the female also has to be silenced. And I assume it gets silenced at the zygote level so that once we go into moral, etc., it's always silenced that way, all right? So, all right. Therefore, what we can say is that the sex is determined first at the genetic level by the sperm, all right? And then, so all of these layers will go kind of one on top of the other, if you will, meaning that each layer is necessary but not sufficient to arrive eventually at a normal sexual orientation as adults, like 20 years later after the fertilization or 20 plus years later, okay? What comes after the genetic level, then embryologically we go zygote, morula, blastocyst, implantation, then gastrula. At the gastrula level, we have the three main layers, the three germ layers from which all of the organs and tissues come, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm, all right? And then gastrulation continues with organogenesis, the forming of the organs. In the first 8 weeks, so the first 2 months, is that organogenesis. In fact, I've mentioned that by the end of the 8th week of embryonic development, by the end of the 2nd month, basically all of the major organs and systems are in place, but in miniature because the little embryo is about maybe 1 inch long, all right, from head to rump, as they say. And so all the organs, the major organs are in place there, but in miniature. And functioning to their degree. One that begins functioning very early on and very fast is the heart because of the circulation that needs to happen. All that tissue is growing very fast. Remember how I mentioned we grow about 5,000 times from the zygotic stage to 9 months later, a 1 foot long baby, more or less. If you do the math, it's about 5,000 times. So it's by far the fastest growth spurt that we have in our entire life. And that needs a lot of circulation, a lot of ATPs, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so all that happens early on. What happens with the genes that are in the X and the Y chromosomes for male and femaleness, they start expressing, right, those genes if everything goes okay, and typically they will press into proteins, regulatory proteins that are the ones that will then guide the hormones to develop the proper glands. So the second layer is a hormonal layer, which for women is going to be estrogen, for men testosterone. The third layer is going to be the glands, the actual glands, the sex glands, the primary sex glands, again, the ovaries for women, and the testicles or testes for men. So you see that these 3 layers, right, happen gradually, all beginning with the genetic information, but all that genetic information needs to express. The protein needs to be functional, folded correctly, 3-dimensional, the active site, etc. Then the receptors of those proteins also have to be working properly for the proper docking and expression and so forth, and all the cascades that need to occur. So you can see that at the biochemical level, it's quite complex, the whole scenario, right? All these pathways, just the pathways for sex development. And it's all at the physiological level. physiological level, meaning that there's no psychological level yet because there's no functional brain yet. All right, there will be a brain primordia, the lobes, the frontal lobes, and so forth, the different, the protoencephalo, the diencephalo, and so forth, different parts of the brain, and the spinal cord are just beginning to develop, which, by the way, they develop from the ectoderm. As the ectoderm pours into the central groove of the gastrula, right? Very interesting. You can watch some videos of how that occurs. All right, so basically the first 8 weeks. The major organs are in place in miniature, except for the sexual organs. The sexual organs take a little bit longer, almost a month, to about the 12th week for them to be defined. So this little slide shows you an 8-week embryo, and there is a protuberance there between the legs that is just known as that, as a protuberance. But that protuberance is still undifferentiated. Undifferentiated meaning that protuberance can either become the penis for the male or the clitoris for the female, right? So for the sexual organs to develop, to differentiate into maleness or femaleness, the organs, not at the genetic level, because that was determined at fertilization, but the actual organs, it takes about another 3 weeks to a month, to about the 12th week. By the 12th week, then that little embryo actually changes to fetus. The technical term changes to fetus. That protuberance will either develop into a penis for the boys or a clitoris for the girls, all right, which are the homologous structures. So you can see here at 28 weeks, much more developed. It's obvious that this is a little boy, okay? So it's interesting that the sexual organs take a little longer to develop than the other vital organs in the body. And that's also how we can explain the existence of nipples in males, because the existence of nipples, since they're secondary sexual characteristics, they develop earlier. They develop earlier, probably around 8th or 9th week or so, at least the primordial cells on the chest there, all right, on the thoracic covering, both in male and female. And it's only later when the hormones are being produced, either estrogen or progesterone, that the glands internally will develop into functional mammary glands or not. All right, but it's interesting that the nipples are there before the primary sexual characteristics are more determined, more differentiated. All right, we can move forward then. 9 months later, there's birth. And hopefully everything went okay with the integration of these first 3 layers, which is all at the physiological level. And now there are added layers that come on. And those added layers are at first, for the first dozen years, more or less, mostly psychological. And then there is, during the adolescence, again, a combination of psychological and physiological, all right? But after birth, for the first dozen years, more or less, the predominant sexual influence is going to be more at the psychological level. In other words, the little boy or the little girl, how they see themselves as boy or girl. And it's a gradual process. And it's also a natural process, unless someone interferes with that natural process, directly. And it has happened before. We know that along history, a number of couples have wanted to have a firstborn boy, but the firstborn was a girl. So they dressed her as a boy and taught her to be a boy. And so she was like a tomboy, what do you call that? A tomboy girl, right? But she's really a girl. And conversely, it has also happened that some couples have wanted to have a girl. Maybe they have already 4 or 5 boys. I don't know, but they wanted a girl. But a boy was born, so they're going to dress that boy, treat him as a girl and so forth. It's happened before. Obviously, you can see it's not hard to see what that's going to do to the psyche of that child, right? It's going to essentially mess them up because they don't have the infrastructure, the physiological infrastructure to deal with the kind of psychological pressure that's being placed on them. All right, so these childhood years are crucial for the normal heterosexual development. And this is where we can say that gender starts to impinge on the person, because up until now, the brain was not that differentiated that could detect, as far as we know, all right, that the fetus sees himself or herself as boy or girl. In fact, when the baby is born, it's not, we cannot say this for sure, because how do we get inside the baby's brain, right? What they're thinking or what they're feeling. But from many observations, it seems like babies don't really have a consolidated gender identity. And it's pretty, yeah, it's normal to think in those terms, because we know that the gender identity is going to be more gradual than the sexual identity. The sexual was determined more physiological, right? So here also what happens is a lot of influences on the child. Normally, the first influence is from the parents. So again, what we have for parents, well, it turns out we'll have one man and one woman. So there is an influence of each there upon the child, upon the growing child, even from baby through toddler and so forth, and the way they're being, the way that the parents are normally, naturally interacting. It's obvious, like the mother is going to interact with the child as a woman, and the father is going to interact with that child as a man. It's normal, okay? All right, so there's this development during childhood that has a lot of influences coming in, and the child, one way or another, has to develop an identity. Self-identity and social identity. What do I mean by that? Self-identity, that the child realizes that he or she is not someone else. Okay, I don't know if you've ever seen those little videos of a baby inside a mirror. They're trying to get into the mirror because they're trying to play with the baby over there. They don't have a self-identity yet, all right? So it's really neat to watch those little videos. They don't really have a self-identity that we can tell. So that comes gradually, and it may be 1, 2, 3 years before that happens, but certainly at least months. Alongside with that, of the self-identity, there's also an identity that I am self and not others. Okay, so there are others that are also selves. So all this is a psychological development of the child, as the child realizes that there are others like him who are not him or her. And that amplifies immensely once the child starts going to school, even pre-kinder or pre-K3, pre-K4, right? Because now the child is socializing with strangers, other kids their age who they have never seen before, and come from other parents, other families who may not even have the same value system, etc. So going to school or the pre-kinder years, it's a huge to-do for the child and to handle that. But generally, normally, the kids do okay because we are a very sociable species. We're a very sociable species, and we're also very curious. So we naturally go and talk to other people. In fact, that's one of the challenges nowadays. We cannot be naive anymore about raising children, and we know that not everyone has the best intentions with regards to children today, adults and teenagers, and therefore one has to be careful with children because spontaneously they tend to trust anyone else, and they tend to trust adults, and they'll go talk to any adult in principle that they see or any other child, right? They don't know. Okay, so all that dynamic is, again, pretty complex, and these are influences that can happen on the child. right? Along those self-identity and social identity is also the sexual identity, how they see themselves as boy or girl. And they're looking at models around them, how to behave as boy and girl. It's interesting also, Jean Piaget was one of the first psychologists to study children way back at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. He was a Swiss psychologist, child psychologist, and pedagogue. And he would just observe children. He noticed, for example, in a playground, naturally, the boys go to one area and the girls go to another area. So they tend to cluster by sex, all right? By sex. Different, for example, in the teenage years, especially in the higher teenage years, they tend to mix much more. But for children, they feel more comfortable in their own gender, all right? And so they're picking up how to be a boy, how to be a girl from the other boys and girls around them. And it's very interesting to watch those psychosocial and sexual dynamics that occur just naturally. All right. So we fast forward for about a dozen years, and we come to the maturation of the sexual organs. On average, a dozen years, it depends. That's basically when the child hits puberty, which would be then by definition no longer a child, but an adolescent. And for women, when they start ovulating, for men, when they start producing sperm, ejaculating. So now comes this adolescent time, which is challenging because now the hormones are flying very fast, especially the sexual hormones, right? Because of the maturation that has occurred in the sexual characteristics, again, primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So we have a combination of physiological and psychological. But that combination doesn't always go up to par or even-handed, all right? Sometimes kids mature physiologically faster, and sometimes they mature psychologically faster. Generally, they mature faster physiologically, physically. And what happens is that girls start looking more and more like adults in their body, but they still have the mind of a girl. And boys the same. In fact, in general, girls tend to mature a little faster than boys. At any rate, you can see that girls already started looking like women, but they still have a young mind, and the same for boys. That's a danger, right? Because now, once the sexual organs are operative and functional, then they're fertile in principle, and the attraction is there. But they may not have the psychological wherewithal to resist and to put into check that sexual attraction and the rush of hormones, all right, because they still don't have a mature brain. Did we talk about synaptic pruning? I think at one point I did a synaptic pruning of what happens to the human brain as the synapses connect. Like strengthening or weakening. Right, of consolidating pathways, that there is a, during the teen years, actually, the early teen years, we have kind of the maximum amount of synaptic connections going on. And then there is what is known as synaptic pruning. In other words, we start losing pathways because it's too much, too many synapses. The synapses, as you know, are the connections between the neurons, especially on the cortex, it's the real cortex, where thinking is occurring and feelings and all the, both the rational and the irrational behavior. And so there are too many pathways, and therefore the brain starts a pruning process of dismantling some of those synapses, and pathways are consolidated, stronger. It's like going from kind of many dirt roads into just one or two highways, major highways, okay? And that takes another 10 to 12 years more or less, so that in the end, the brain, the human brain doesn't finish maturing between 20 to 25 years of age. Remember my asking, when does the car insurance drop? No, did I ask you about that? No? When does the car insurance drop? if you're paying for your insurance or the parents are paying, they're waiting for you to be 25 years old, because at 25, the car insurance drops. The insurance industry has figured that out. They take basically the upper end of that range. So what I'm saying is that the human brain does not finish maturing organically until between 20 to 25 years of age on average. So on average, we can say 22 and a half years. On average, that's when we have a mature brain, all right? It has to do with synapses. The size of the brain is already at the teenage years. The size itself is okay, is the adult size, but it's in the fine tuning of the synaptic connections that takes another dozen years more or less. And the car industry uses the upper limit of that because from their statistics, it proves them accidents, right? What's one of the first things that happens with an accident? Driver's license. What's on the driver's license? Date of birth. So they can figure automatically, this is data, what age had a person who got into an accident, right? Especially when they are at fault. And they can see a very clear distinction statistically before 25 years of age and after 25 years of age. There's a drop in accidents after 25 years of age nationally. You can imagine the number of accidents happen on a daily basis nationwide. So when you pull these results, that database is huge. It's very robust, all right? And that's throughout the world pretty much because that's how long the human brain takes to fine tune into adulthood. So you can see that the sexual organs pretty much reach maturity the first dozen years, let's say 12, but our brains don't mature until another dozen years later, 24. And so there's a lag. I have mature sexual organs, but I don't have a mature brain. It's a challenge. And that's why adolescent, that's why the teenage years are called adolescent in the Latin, because adolescent comes from the word adolescere. Adolescere is the verb, and the root word is dolum, D-O-L-O-M, L-U-M, dolum, which means pain. Dolor in Spanish, dolor, that's where it comes from, okay? The adolescent is in pain. Why is the adolescent in pain? Because their body is growing basically faster than their mind, and they're in pain. That's an internal struggle. It's an internal pain, if you will. Angst, exactly. The adolescent angst. There you go. It's an internal awkwardness between their mind and their body. All right, and especially even more so when these people doing the growth spurt, right? From one year to another, they gain a foot of height or something, and so there's an angst going on, and that's the adolescent years. Challenging because that's also when the sexual identity starts consolidating into adulthood, either as a normal heterosexual or any deviation from that. So you can see that there are these layers of integration that in the best case scenario, everything goes okay, and we become normal heterosexual adults. But something can go wrong at any stage of these layers of integration, beginning with the genetic layer, hormonal, glandular, the identities, maturation of the organs, etc. So either at the physiological level, the psychological level, any number of factors can go wrong so that the person may not develop the normal average sexual orientation as heterosexual, okay? So let's look at a few influences here. Again, the ideal is for that harmonious integration so that the sex and the gender are, actually I should put a equal sign here, are the same, right? That my orientation matches my genetics. When it doesn't, it's mostly at the psychological level, at the psychosocial level, not at the genetic level or not at the physiological level. And of course, there are a number of physiological anomalies that occur, the syndromes, for example, Klinefelter syndrome, Turner syndrome, where you have XYY or XXX and so forth. You have extra chromosomes, so the sex chromosomes, or they're not expressed correctly. You have an XO, for example, or there's no, I don't know what, YO, but XO can happen. Typically, these men or women are infertile, they're sterile, their sexual organs don't develop properly because the proper load of genes is not there, all right? And beyond that, sometimes they may have an ambiguous genitalia. They may have overgrown clitoris, or they may have what is known as a micropenis, which is very small. None of that is functional. Some men may develop breasts. Some women may not develop breasts if there are either genetic or hormonal or glandular abnormalities, right? But that's at the physiological level. And thanks be to God, it's more rare. And a number of those are so drastic that they just don't survive the embryonic stage. And those will be part of those spontaneous abortions that occur typically early on, right? Sorry? Exactly. And therefore, they're not compatible, they're not viable, and there will be spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, typically early on. But some do make it to birth and even adulthood, and then it's challenging. They have to decide basically whether it's their primary orientation when they have what is known as ambiguous genitalia. But those are not the cases that I'm talking about, because transgenderism has to do with feelings, sentiments, emotions. All right, so it's definitely at the psychosocial level. In fact, a proof that that is radically at the psychosocial level and not the physiological level is that some of these transgenders have transitioned, but not fully. In other words, they have not done what is known as the bottom surgery, and therefore they can still be fertile. Either a man who transitions to be a female or a woman who transitions to be a male, but they keep their sexual organs, and those sexual organs are functional, all right? And then you get these awkward men with a beard and a belly being pregnant. It actually turns out it's a woman who has gone through the hormonal treatment to develop facial hair, but she's still XX, all right? Even though her new identity is a male identity. All right, so it's mostly at the psychosocial level. Meaning that this, what does that tell you? That tells you that this influence is mostly after birth, all right? So the argument that I was born this way is very, very questionable. There's no scientific evidence to corroborate that claim that I was born this way, okay? Because they weren't. It's at the psychosocial level, the influence. All right, let's move forward. These are some factors that influence the sexual development, either normal or abnormal. First, the parents, on average, those are the first humans that we normally encounter at birth and going forward, the first few years of our lives. Also, variants from the traditional mother and father at home and the roles that they play. Then siblings, if there are siblings. Older, younger siblings, they have an influence if there are few, if it's only 2 siblings, or if it's 8 or 10, all right? A lot of dynamics between the siblings that goes on, the boys and the girls. Beyond that, we expand to the more extended family, cousins, uncles, aunts, how that child is relating, and those other family members relating to the child. And even beyond that, friends, as the child is socializing. Then, of course, one can add traumas to the developing child, especially early on. Those traumas can be at times life-changing and lifelong, very, very hard to dislodge when there are traumas, particularly sexual traumas on a child early on. It kind of marks them for life. And there are therapies and so forth that can be done, but some of those traumatic experiences may mark that person for life. okay, and may actually deviate them from their normal orientation. All right, then comes the whole issue of school, and in school you realize whether it's pre-kinder, but more in the elementary school years, the child can think a little bit more and feel and so forth. Obviously, in school, not every kid comes from the same family and the same value system. So there are many, many different value systems. It's rather heterogeneous, particularly in our societies, in our cultural milieu, where we have quite a bit of mix of different cultures and so forth. And therefore, not every kid in school who is a peer from that child is going to have the same value system, including the sexual values. Right? So all that has an influence, and it's outside of the home. So unless the child talks about that at home, it may go undetected, but the influence is still there the next day when she or he goes back to school with that influence from peers. Talked about the teen years, and particularly teen experimentation and preteen experimentation, sexual experimentation. This one in particular is frankly extremely damaging, okay? Because think about it for a moment. Let's try to be a little detached and just try to think about it somewhat objectively. Teen sexual experimentation and even preteen sexual experimentation, what happens is that sexual experimentation, the very first thing off the bat is that it's not going to be open to life. It's not life-giving, because these teenagers that are having sexual intimacy, the vast majority of them don't want to get pregnant, they don't want to father a child or mother a child, right? Again, the dynamic changes for the girl and the boy, for sure, because the boys are not the ones getting pregnant. So already the dynamic is a very different dynamic. That's why I say in general, there's much more investment on the part of the woman, of the female, on that sexual intimacy. She has much more to risk. Even aside from the pregnancy issue, is you never know what the fellow is bringing with him, all right? Or where he's been before. He's with this woman, which other women he's been with before, and what he's bringing from that other relationship with him. He may not even know. As you notice in one of the slides that I put there, I think it was under NFP, or under contraceptives, the STDs, socially acquired diseases, sexually acquired diseases, are skyrocketing in the United States, all right? And that's a lot has to do with this experimentation that is going on. So it's a type of sexual intimacy that is truncated. It's not the full, open, loving, generous, mature, responsible relationship that is meant to be, including the possibility of having a child, right? And so it's a truncated type of relationship that is strictly based just on the pleasure of the dynamic, of the intimacy, and the immediate pleasure of the intimacy. Also, moving forward a little bit, consider how many couples really marry their first sexual encounter. Let's say if they were experimenting intimacy during the teenage years, how many of those teenagers actually end up marrying that person? It's in the minority. It's a small group. Sometimes you hear, oh yes, this is my sweetheart, my high school sweetheart. Okay, they say that sometimes at the wedding or later on in life, this was my high school sweetheart, him or her. But it's rare. It's rare, and that's why it catches our attention, precisely because it's not the norm. What does that mean? It means that that experimentation that I'm having in the teenage years is not going to be long last. It's going to be temporary. I'm going to move on. He's going to move on, and she's going to move on from that intimacy after the intimacy. And yet the intimacy is the most intimate thing that a couple can do, right? And therefore, it tends to cheapen the whole dynamic. It cheapens it because it's not going to last. And so all that teen and preteen sexual experimentation is extremely, extremely dangerous and damaging to the stability of relationships later in life, all right? And we see it sadly reflected in the high divorce rate in our society and so forth. That's just one of the issues there. Then I have here society at large. I actually have another slide on that. Society at large, because of the value system that is out there, which we see that sexuality has been commercialized, all right? Because industry has figured out pretty quickly that because we have this pulsation with us, the sexual orientation and the sexual desire that is there latent in every normal person, then they can exploit that to sell us something. You know, you tell me, why does toothpaste have to be sexy? Why does a car have to be sexy? It's a car, it's a means of transportation. It gets me from here to there. What does that have to do with sex? And yet, you look, just about any product on the market today has to have some kind of what they call sex appeal. But that's an exploitation of human sexuality, simply because it's appealing more to our desires and feelings and emotions than to the logic. Sticking with the car example, you know what is the one factor that most people buy a car for? What is the one characteristic that most people make the final decision on a car? What do you think it is? The brand, the make, the motor, the gas efficiency, the tires are inflated. But the one factor is the color of the car. Can you tell me anything that is further away from the functioning of the car, from the mechanics of the car, than its color? Okay? It's literally, like I say, skin deep, right? It's just amazing. But most people make the final decision on a car based on the color, that I like the color or not. I mean, the car could have a spectacular color and be empty inside. And it has a beautiful color, right? So we have to be careful because we're very sociable beings, but we're also very naive, and we tend to swallow. Who usually checks information? You don't check sources and things like that. You know, it's just pumped out on the internet and people believe it because we're gullible. We're also a very gullible species. So basically, sex today has been commercialized in our contemporary world. Sex is seen as a type of entertainment, right? Honey, are we making love tonight or are we going to the movies? And that kind of thing. Not to mention the pornography industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Incredible. When you get into that industry, the real hardcore things of kidnapping people and sex slaves and all that, it's just absolutely, it's beyond sickness, all right? But that's the pornography industry, and it's all out there. It's on the cell phone. Get online and it pops up. And who asked for it? It just pops up because that's the society we live in. Therefore, we have to really be alert to try to have as normal a formation as possible. And at the end of the day, when we look around and we say, no wonder with all these influences upon society today, starting with childhood moving forward, no wonder that we are having these anomalies crop up, all right, where people actually want to change their sex or their gender. So the one slide that I was adding here is, I want to point out, basically, these are the two main hormones that are driving the sex drive. But you notice they're both esters, they're 4 rings, all right, they're 4-ring esters. And the skeleton of the 2 molecules is pretty much identical, all right? There are 4-ring carbon esters, but it's on the radicals. For example, there's a carboxyl here, right? And hydroxyl here. So pretty much the rest of the molecule on the right-hand side looks very similar. So what do you think is the active site of these molecules, these two hormones? It's obviously down here on the left, right? This is the active site, but because that's what's different between estrogen and testosterone. And one determines femaleness, the other one determines maleness. But the skeleton of the two molecules is very, very similar. So it's really all about these radicals, you know, carboxyl and hydroxyl, pretty much. It's that little tiny difference makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to point out that normal women have some amount of testosterone in them, and normal men, we have also some amount of estrogen in us, okay? There's more testosterone in women than estrogen in men. But you can see these are nanograms per deciliter. That's the range between 15 and 70 nanograms per deciliter. Whereas for men, we have about 60 picograms, per ml of estrogen. And that is normal, and that is healthy, and that's important because it maintains a balance. It maintains a balance, all right? It actually has to do with a normal sexual drive. I was reading up a little bit more. For men and women to have a normal sexual drive, a heterosexual drive, women need a little bit of testosterone and men need a little bit of estrogen. But the amounts are very different. More testosterone in women than estrogen in men. But it's there. So it's not that women are just 100% the estrogen and men 100% testosterone. No, there's a little tiny amount of the other hormones, and that's for normal, healthy metabolism. Okay. So now let's look a bit at this phenomenon that we're experiencing in our times of transgender, which clinically is known as GID, Gender Identity Disorder, in the DSM-5. You're familiar with the DSMs, right? The DSM-5, DSM-6 is the latest one, is the diagnostic manual. In the DSM-5, it was defined as disorder. But now in the DSM-6, it's defined as dysphoria. So they kept the D, but they changed the wording to dysphoria, because disorder has the connotation that is not order, that is not norm. So they're going away from a statistical normality, all right? What I'm trying to say by this is that perhaps in the DSM-6, there's more ideology that has filtered into that new manual. There's ideology. I see ideology in biology textbooks, for example, which is supposed to be about nature, right? But it filters in.
Well, I think it's also because of the negative connotations that come with the word disorder.
Yeah.
Speak.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, we can bounce the aspect of, what do you say, ideology in both directions. Namely,
yeah.
The ideological view that there is something, like let's say, biologically retarded or damaged
Right.
about the individual. So I understand that because the word disorder, just as the disease, carries with it some pretty aggressive connotations.
Sure. Consider this. This is a diagnostic manual, all right? And therefore, there is a norm. There is a metabolism that works normally. When it doesn't work normally, it's a disorder. They did not get rid of the word disorder for all of the diagnostics. So if they had done a blanket elimination of disorder throughout all of the diagnostics, I would understand it.
But most of the others don't overlap with the identity and social experience of the person interpersonally.
Right. Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that they are getting away from being as objective as possible. That we have objectively a disorder in the sense that it's off the norm. You know, Don't want to call it disorder? How about abnormality? Sounds even worse, right?
Yeah.
But it is, because it's off the norm. So if it's not normal, it's abnormal.
The word dysphoria already implies something that has deviated, but it doesn't carry that same. So I think the what's it called, the objectivity of it remains, because there's still an indication that something has split off.
Right. Yes, I understand they're trying not to pass a value judgment on the person, which I agree with, because we never, like I've been saying, we never judge the conscience of the person. Okay. Perhaps it's a question of interpretation, but
That's what I mean, interpretation.
yeah, it is.
But,
It is.
The term dysphoria maintains the definition of what's occurring, that there has been some kind of a departure from something, or disconnects. So I think it's still objective.
Yeah.
It's just that it accomplishes both. It remains objective without the potential harm. And these communities get enough harm as it is. They tend to be vulnerable to.
Yeah, so I understand there's also prejudice, right? There's also prejudice out there for sure, with people who are intolerant and don't make a distinction between the person and their actions. But anyway, so for whatever it is, it's what it is today in the DSM-6 is dysphoria, but at least the acronym is still the same, GID. But what I wanted to point out is that basically it's at the level of feeling, how they feel. I feel that I'm in the wrong body, okay? So it's typically at the physiological level. There's really, like I say, not that we know of, a physiological underpinning to this, to these feelings.
I can discuss this with you after you're done.
Sure, no problem. Let's, okay, so let's look at the treatment then, because I'm still holding up kind of on the bioethics of it. I'm still just trying to describe what goes on for the transition, for the transgender, all right? The treatment is fairly complicated. It involves about 3 layers, again, about 3 layers. The result, right, is for a man to look like a woman externally, and for a woman to look like a man. And then they can behave accordingly. But it involves, actually, there's a first layer to this, which is psychological treatment. The first one is actually psychological treatment. Let me put it here. Oops, what happened? Let me go back. Whoops, messing it up. Give me a minute. There. No, it's not working. Okay, I'm just going to put it here. And then maybe put it, oh, maybe I can do this. The first one is actually to see if the person really wants to transition or not. So they'll spend typically several months in therapy, in psychotherapy, to see how consolidated that other identity is in the person. After that has been determined, then they move into the actual procedure of transitioning. And the transitioning typically involves 2 parts. The first part is hormonal. The second part is surgical. And the surgical itself is subdivided into 2 parts also, what they call the top surgery and the bottom surgery. All right, so you can see that it goes into more serious and serious issues that may or may not be reversible once they're done. But the hormonal therapy, essentially, in general, is to give male hormones to the woman who wants to transition to a man, and to give female hormones to the man transitioning to the woman. It's done in small amounts and so forth, and very monitored, because you know that hormones have a high impact. It's a small amount, has a high impact on the body and on the metabolism. So this is done gradually to the point where the woman will start changing her voice and also develop facial hair and so forth. And the man will start losing his facial hair, all right? And the voice may also change more effeminate tone. Then once they go into the surgery, the stop surgery for women is a double mastectomy, and for men, of course, is breast enlargement. And then the bottom surgery is the removal of the genital organs, plus trying to develop a pseudo-vagina and a pseudo-penis. That can be done surgically, all right? How functional they are is a different story, but what I'm trying to say by this is that clinically, it can be done, just clinically. But as you can see, deeper and deeper into the transition, there's more and more commitment, right? Some of these are reversible. At some point, it's not reversible, especially when they get into the mutilation. All right, I also want to point out that transgender is not homosexuality, because they're different feelings altogether. It's not the feeling for, not a man having, desiring another man. It's actually a man who feels he's a woman. And the same for the woman. It's not a woman desiring another woman, but it's a woman who feels she's a man. However, once the transition happens, functionally, it comes out to be the same functionally, because you end up with a man who transitions to a woman who now will feel attracted to a man. But her biology underneath is a male biology. And the same for the woman transitioning. So in the end, functionally ends up being a similar dynamic at the end of the day. It's a growing issue and challenge in our society, to the point that it's been in the journals. This is one that I spotted in 2017. National Geographic, it's a pretty prestigious journal. It's been published for decades and decades. I remember when my brother and I were little kids at home, my dad was working for Alitalia, and we used National Geographic. My parents used National Geographic to decide on vacations. Once a year, he would get tickets from the airline, and he would, so anyway, just to point out that National Geographic has been publishing for years and years, decades, all right? And in January 2017, the entire issue was devoted to transgenderism, the entire issue. This is the cover. As you can see, there's a blow up the cover here, just mostly the faces. And one of the tenets of transgenderism is to deny what we know as male-female binary sex, all right? Male-female binary sex, in other words, that there are two sexes, male and female. That is denied by the transgender community or mentality, that they talk about a spectrum, And therefore, you can end up having as many genders really as you have feelings, because it's all about how I feel. And here's an example, right, of various types of transgenders. They give you the names there. In this issue, National Geographic discovered 15 genders, 15, 1-5, all right? However, they are actually short, because the UN now has discovered about 30 genders. So what happens is that it's just gone beyond any logic really, because it's just how I feel, all right? And imagine how many feelings we can have. You know, some are long-lasting feelings, some are momentary feelings, but it's basically just at the level of how I feel. And that's the challenge, is that the this community keeps expanding and expanding to be as inclusive as possible, but it's an open-ended inclusiveness because any feeling will essentially qualify already as a type of gender. Now, I do want to point out one characteristic here that struck me. When you see all of these persons, all these people, what kind of age group do you think they're at? They're not children, prepubescent, right? But they're not older adults. They're not, I would say no one in here is beyond their 20s. I don't think any of these are more than 20-something years old, if that. Okay, so it's a fairly narrow range what they use. Okay, their population or their sample, it's a narrow age range from the teens to the young adults, basically. And what I'm trying to say by that is that normally in those age groups of teens and young adults, they're still trying to consolidate their sexual identity. So it could be that they don't really know exactly yet how they feel, especially if there have been issues before as a child, traumas and so forth, that they have not been able to work out in a healthy way. They may be very reticent to accept their normal sexuality, their genetic sexuality. So it's an age that is still fairly young. And it just struck me from the start that all of these 15 that they show inside here, they only show half of them. They're showing 7, right? They chose, I guess, the most significant 7. But like I say, there are 15. You can read the article. They're all young. They're all young. Teens, early 20s at most. And so what I'm thinking is, how representative is that too of the general population? Beyond the 30s, 40s, 50s, okay? And in fact, speaking with clinicians and pediatricians and friends of mine who are MDs, they tell me the vast majority of those who have questioning sexual orientation in their teen and young adults, the vast majority work it out, and they end up landing in the normal heterosexual orientation given enough time. The challenge today, though, is that sometimes parents are reacting about this a little prematurely, because if the child is beginning to express a transgender orientation, some parents are actually facilitating puberty blockers, what are known as puberty blockers, so that they don't undergo the normal development. And the parents will say, so that way the child can decide what gender they want to be when they grow up. But I'm thinking in the meantime, you as parents are interfering in their normal development with these puberty blockers. So how free are they really in deciding what they want to be if they're going to be denied the normal hormone that they should be having, boys, testosterone, girls, estrogen, all right? So that's definitely a bioethical issue. The whole issue of puberty blockers and interfering with the normal development of teenagers transitioning into sexual development. Okay. Let me skip this slide and just go to the bottom line here. I want to introduce these doctors, McHugh and colleagues, because when transgenderism started in society several decades ago, these people were, these doctors were at the University Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Anyway, they were the ones who invented the therapies and the protocols for transitioning. So these were the pioneers. Johns Hopkins. At Johns Hopkins Medical Center. And they were the ones who invented the transitioning protocols of the therapy, the top therapy, the bottom surgery, all those procedures. These were the pioneers. And for decades, they did that with men and women who came for transitioning. What happened was they were tracking their patients before and after. You know that there's always a suicide background rate in society, right? And the people who were coming to them were discontent with their own gender and they wanted to transition, okay? And there was a suicide rate among that population. But what they noticed after transitioning and years after transitioning, that suicide rate skyrocketed. It's about 15 times more suicide rate after the transition. So if they were unhappy before, they were much more unhappy after the transition. And just by the numbers of attempted or accomplished suicide, that went through the roof. And so they said, in conscience, we cannot continue with these procedures because we're not benefiting our patients. We're actually harming our patients. So they gave it up. And they did a study. And they published that study. And this is it. It's the journal, The New Atlantis. All right. So that's the reference. It's in the fall of 2016. And this is the link down here. It's available online. You can look it up. But basically, there, this team of doctors present the evidence for why they stopped. Because they noticed that they were actually harming their patients more. And because the first principle of medicine is to do no harm, then they stopped, okay? Because they realized that these people, even though they want to transition, once they transition, they are less happy than they were before. Okay? And there's no way of telling that beforehand, right? Because they're not living as the other gender. So the bottom line, at least from the principle bioethics, is that separating sex from gender is not a healthy thing to do. Much more healthy is to work out the issues because typically they're going to be at the psychosocial level, meaning that the physiological is okay, is healthy, is good. But it's at the psychosocial level that needs to be worked out, all right? And it can be worked out. So interfering on the physiology of the person who wants to transition doesn't solve the issue, doesn't solve the underlying issue, because the underlying issue is precisely at the psychosocial level. And that's why, at least from the principle of bioethics, we would say essentially no to transitioning. All right. Spend the whole time talking. I don't know if anyone has any question or comment to make. I understand it's a delicate lecture, and I'm giving you one perspective, which has always been the principal perspective. Of course, the utilitarian modality would say, well, it can be done, and it's not illegal, so do whatever the patient wants. If the patient wants to transition, just transition them and let them work it out, right? Because for them, the end will justify whatever means it's done. But of course, in principle bioethics, we wouldn't accept that. We have to look at the procedure itself and how it's actually harming these people more than doing good. It's a challenging issue. It's out there. It's in the social milieu. It's in the public school system. Okay? It's all part of the plurality of value that we have to deal with today. Okay, let me just stop here. I don't know if anyone wants to make any question or any comment on this. Yes, Luis? Go ahead.
There's a dimension here that's missing because there is actually growing genetic evidence for pathways that are associated with transgender developments.
There is? Well, I'd like to see that evidence because I've looked for it. I never found it.
When I write the report for this one, I'll have that one with like citations and stuff.
Okay.
And
there is genetic evidence.
Yeah. Often with like estrogen pathways, but there's also other gene and gene associated genes with each other that tend to work in tandem. That they're finding. And additionally, this, I'm not sure if I would even call this just a principled bioethic approach. I think it's a subset it's a subset of principles.
Yes. How so?
I think there can be a principled approach that works with other information that's available on the subject. For example, I'm aware of this this publication, but there's also been responses to it.
Yes, there has been.
Community, but those aren't present here. And on top of that, there's also the component of, although this isn't directly related, well, I mean, it's not directly related to the clinical aspects or the scientific aspects. There's a lot of misinformation out there about these people, and they tend to suffer under like rates of murder, the victims of murder and abuse on a level that.
Oh yes, on that I agree 100%. There's a lot of prejudice, unfortunately, and people feel threatened by things like this, just like with any other kind of deviancy. For example, I don't know, to cite an extreme case, whenever an albino is born in Africa, it's the person is either considered a god or a goddess or a devil, right? And
neither of which is appropriate.
Exactly.
People tend to fear, even in like, for example, much more scientifically grounded culture, people
Yes.
sometimes respond with fear or rejection of things
Yes.
they don't understand. So those are my thoughts on
Sure, understood. I think that some of those feelings may also be, so we have to consider also that talking about human sexuality is a very, very delicate subject, of course, okay? And it's like I try to emphasize this whole issue of the layers, of the complexity of it. But we can also talk about appetites at the psychological level that are there. And there's a certain fluidity in those appetites, if they're opened or not. Typically early on, just like in the psychological appetite, just like we have an appetite, for example, well, I give the example of sushi, because when I was first told if I like sushi, and I said, what is sushi? I said, well, basically it's raw fish. And I said, yucky, I don't want to eat raw fish, okay? And now I love sushi. So it's an acquired taste. Once I tasted the sushi, I loved it, okay? That can happen. I don't know really about, the transgender community as such. I know a little bit more about the homosexual community, that sometimes when there's early on experimentation, same-sex experimentation, appetites are opened that are there, latent. But it doesn't mean that we have to open those appetites, because then it's kind of hard to close them back up. There's something that becomes new in this person's, how do I want to say this? sexual experience, thank you, sexual experience. It happens also with couples. If one of the couple, let's say like a heterosexual couple, right, a man and a woman, if one has had more sexual experiences than the other, it's going to be difficult for them to have the same level of complementarity in their sexual intimacy.
Yeah, they're sensitive.
Right, there are sensitivities there. One will be unfulfilled, the other one will be super fulfilled or over fulfilled, okay? And it makes a big difference. So that's what I'm saying. Also, I've seen it more in the homosexual community. Appetites are opened, or again, the traumas of youth that gave a coloring to that person's sexuality, but was not a normal type of sexual intimacy, all right? It happens in homosexuality. Specifically, we are adults here, and I'm talking bioethics, but it happens in anal sex, for example. Remember way back when I was doing my first doctorate in Rome in the 1990s, I was looking at the embryonic development of the fetus, and there is wiring, there is neurological wiring that occurs not only from the male and the female sexual organs to the brain, to the pleasure centers of the brain, but also from the anus to the brain. Yeah, and so one can wonder, why is that? But what I'm saying is, a person who has experienced anal sex, those centers activate. A person who has not experienced anal sex, those centers do not activate, you see? And so that's why it's challenging, and that's why I place a lot of emphasis in the teen experimentation and the preteen experimentation, because by and large, that experimentation is a negative experience in the long term for the overall holistic development of that person, okay? The deviations can start there. Appetites that are open that are not normal appetites. Anyway, you can see by my trying to choose the words as possibly as I don't want to be offensive in any way, but I see these dynamics, and I always come back to the issue that we never ever judge the conscience of a person. We're looking at behavior objectively, because that does have an impact on society, the behavior. The more the alternative behavior becomes acceptable, the behavior, not the orientation, but the behavior, then that is also coloring that society in a certain way. Anyway, anyone want to make a comment? Feel free if you want to. Otherwise, we can end here. And that's it.
I'm all set, Professor. Yeah, thank you so much. It was very clear.
All right. So then after this one, we have two more. Hopefully the next two, well, I think that on the transplant, I always like to end on a positive note, which I hope transplants will be good, because there's a lot of progress there, organ transplantation. But then back to COVID, which is a new lecture that I'm adding this year. That's another one that will be controversial for sure, okay? But we'll get there. All right, if there's nothing else, then I'm going to close down the recording, and God willing, we'll meet again next Monday.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good weekend now. Bye.